again, like Ashley said, we want to thank our sponsors for helping us provide the opportunity for us to do this. We have two great studies tonight. We're looking forward to talking about both of them related to shoulder exercise and/or injury prevention. First of all, I'm Rob Mansky from Wichita State University, and I guess I'm the co-host, and of course my favorite co-host down here on my left. Phil, you're on the left for me, Phil. You're like down here. I don't know where you are. Yeah. Phil Page. Phil, tell everybody about yourself really quick and briefly.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Phil Page. I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm a associate professor at the DPT program at FRANU and editor of IJSPT. So I'm just happy to be here. This is a great opportunity. Looking forward to talking to analysts, Chuck.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Our special guest host today, he was on just a sec. There he is. There he is. There's the good looking guy.
I love
Down
it.
the bottom left. Look at that hair. Look at that head.
Looking good. Just trying to be like Phil Page. He's my hero.
Right. That's right. Our special guest, Chuck Thigpen tonight. Chuck, can you tell everybody just about yourself real quick before we start?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate IJSPT and being hosted tonight. Excited to be here. I'm a Senior Vice President of Clinical Excellence for ATI Physical Therapy, physical therapist and athletic trainer for, I don't know, a really long time, 25 years, maybe slightly less than the good Dr. Page, but close. I saw some of our friends, Chris King from Alabama last week, Phil, but been in the sports medicine setting for a long time. Excited to talk about it. It's fun. We've got Garrett with us tonight. Garrett was a patient of mine when he was a baseball player, before he was a PT and before he got his PhD. And so he can't seem to get away yet.
Wow. Nice. Well, guys, I think we're going to start with, if you don't mind, we're going to start. Well, I didn't even introduce Hillary. Hillary Plummer. She's the senior author of our first study. The first study is effectiveness of shoulder exercise program in Division I collegiate baseball players during the fall season. So Hillary, do you mind just telling everybody briefly about yourself, where you work, what you're doing, and then maybe give us a quick rundown of your study?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Hillary Plummer. My background is in athletic training and biomechanics. I got my PhD at Auburn under Gretchen Oliver, doing a lot of softball and baseball proximity biomechanics work, trying to better understand injury risk factors in baseball and softball players. Currently, I am a quality assurance specialist with the San Diego Padres. It's a fancy title, but basically my job is to find ways that we can reduce elbow injuries in our pitchers and keep them on the field. And if they do get hurt, find ways that we can, get them back on the field performing. So
Cool.
For the study, I do want to acknowledge my co-authors. This project was actually Shannon Plosser's project. She was a USC sports PT fellow, and this was her year-long project that she kind of headed up. She wasn't really interested in doing the writing part, so I kind of took the lead on all of that. And then Paul Diaz, the athletic trainer with USC baseball, was huge help getting us access to the players, helping us set up data collections. And then Nick Lobb did a lot with our statistical analysis. And then, of course, Lori Mishner was overseeing the entire project. So this was definitely a huge undertaking and a big group effort. So I do want to start off by saying this was a pilot study. We realize it's not perfect. There's things we probably could have done better, but really kind of the goal of this was to get some pilot data to eventually do a larger scale intervention study in baseball players. So getting into the study, we all know that baseball players tend to have deficits in shoulder range of motion and strength, and we know that this could potentially be a risk factor for injury. There's a lot of different studies. Chuck and Ellen have done a great job in the high school world as well as the pro world, trying to link range of motion deficits to injury. So they've done a lot of work there. So with this study, we really wanted to see if we could assess the effectiveness of a standardized exercise program during the fall collegiate season on shoulder internal rotation, external rotation, and horizontal adduction, as well as shoulder internal and external rotation strength. For the strength, we did isometric contractions using handheld dynamometer. We then normalized that data to body weight. Players then performed shoulder stretching and strengthening 3 times a week for 1 month, and then the frequency dropped down to 1 time a week for 2 months. This was in large part due to NCAA rules regarding like how much contact the medical and strength and conditioning staff and coaching staff can have with players during the fall season. There's only a certain amount of hours that they can spend with the players. So that was kind of a issue we ran into. We initially like had the program being more frequent than it was, but we had to work around their schedule. And basically what we found, some of the bigger things that we found was that from a range of motion standpoint, the only thing that we saw improvements were horizontal adduction range of motion. And sorry, lost my train of thought. Horizontal adduction range of motion was the big one. And we saw about 71% of the players did have an increase after the intervention in this measure. So we considered them responders. Responders were anybody that increased in the measures greater than the minimal detectable change of 90%. So we saw that in a previous IJSPT article that was done on the lower extremity. We thought that was a really kind of an interesting way to break down the data and see, instead of just looking at means and standard deviations, seeing, were there responders, were there non-responders to these different modifiable risk factors that we were looking at. We also looked at external rotation surplus, and this was a measure that was similar to like how you calculate GERD. You're going to take it's basically the difference between the non-throwing arm and the throwing arm for external rotation. We know that throwing at baseball pitchers in particular are going to have increases in shoulder external rotation range of motion. So we wanted to see like how much of a surplus they actually have in their throwing arm compared to their non-throwing arm. So there was a significant increase from pre-intervention to post-intervention. We kind of expected initially going in to see a change in glenohumeral internal rotation deficit, but we did not observe that. For going back to external rotation surplus, about 56% of our participants were considered responders, so they did have an increase after the intervention in that measure. And then for shoulder strength, we didn't really see as much as we thought we would see. We did see a significant decrease in the ratio between external and internal rotation strength. That did decrease. We also saw that external rotation strength decreased on the throwing arm or the non-throwing arm, but there was no change in our ER ratio. And I guess going into the discussion, like I said, this was mainly a pilot study. We do want to do further work later down the road in a larger sample size. We only had 43 players. Of those players, 21 were pitchers, so the rest were position players. Wasn't necessarily ideal. We would have loved to have a lot more pitchers because we don't really know how the differences in range of motion between pitchers versus the catchers and other position players. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the main points.
Great. Well, thank you very much for giving us that quick synopsis, and then we'll open it up for questions. But before we start, I would like to say, as I read this study, it was really, I thought it was a really easy study to read. It was, it was kind of a simplistic design, but it makes sense. And the writing in the study, I felt, was really well done. You had, the purpose was there, the hypothesis was there. You did your power analysis, you did your reliability testing. I think it flowed well. You kind of checked all the boxes that you needed to, I think, to be a good study. I don't know. What do you think, Phil? Did you feel the same way, or did you feel
no, totally
anything?
I actually did my master's thesis similarly. I did a study. It was about 6 weeks of baseball pitchers using TheraBand. Imagine that, back in 1990. And so I know how hard it is to get us to actually stuff on a regular basis. So cheers to you for doing it, writing it up. And of course, do you know Ace Yogi then at Padres?
I do, yes.
Okay, he's a good friend of mine. Tell him I said hi.
Okay, I don't see him very often. I'm based in Arizona, and he's all over the place, but super I'll let him know.
Shout out. I did love Rob, like you said, it was a good, it would, of course, you hit everything that I look for, kind of statistically. I also want to give a shout out to Laura, of our good friends that you've worked with. We love with her too. Um, the thing that I wanted to kind of out here that I found interesting was not necessarily the kind of the changes that you found, but more or less I always ask this question: so what? Like, you talk about the minimal detectable change being meaningful. I'm not sure that's actually meaningful in terms of what we're looking for. If it's actual differences are actually clinically relevant, like an MCID. I don't know if those exist. But what I wanted to do was kind of pick your brain on what you thought. What, even though these may have been statistically significant, what do you think clinically these changes, were they really meaningful? Is this something that we would want to spend 3 months doing to get those changes?
And I think that's a tough question. I mean, based on some of Chuck and Ellen's work, we know that horizontal adduction range of motion deficits can, be related to injuries. I think it's probably trying to figure out what the optimal dosing of exercises are to make sure that players are maintaining their range of motion, or if they do have a deficit, can we attack that and try to fix it? I think it's a large part of my job is trying to figure out, what is meaningful and what isn't meaningful. There's, optimal dosing. I think it's always going to be individualized. Like we may never see a study that says like, this is the perfect set of exercises that you should do, because everyone's going to respond differently. Each player is going to respond differently. They're developmentally maybe at different, places of maturation. So I think, do I think this is something to continue to look into and target? I think absolutely. We have to do something to try to reduce the amount of elbow and shoulder injuries that we're seeing in baseball players.
Really
Okay.
like.
Oh, go ahead, Phil. Sorry.
I really liked. I want to emphasize Tom's point and what you had said about the responders, because one of the things that a lot of clinicians think is that I see this and I work in my pay, right? And that's what confidence interval is about. It's just saying, no, that's not the case. But what you did was identify descriptively that so many percentages of individuals, as we call a meaningful difference of, that detectable change, which is fantastic. I just don't think a lot of clinicians really understand those psychometric, metric kinds of things in measurement. And I emphasize that you did a lot of great work pulling that through. One of the things that I do want to make sure for our listeners really quick, as part of my job on these podcasts, is to kind of explain, kind of like the confidence interval. How do we interpret the results that a clinician can then make a clinical decision with? So just want to make sure that everyone, if you're reading this paper and you realize that you see these differences, which are great, and then you have a percentage of those that were considered responders, remember that 95 confidence in means that 95% of the time, if we did this study 100 times, 95% of the values would come with range. And so there is that range. The smaller that range is, that smaller that confidence interval, the better that we have a target of what we're trying to do. And it means we have a larger sample size. I thought your power was fine in terms of your power analysis. I ran power analysis and you used an effect size, I think, of 0.446. And typically a 0.5 effect size for power analysis is really good. One of the things I wanted to ask, and I hate to take up too much time on the statistics, but you know how I am, Rob. When you ran the power analysis, you did only use that one study for our internal rotation for GERD to determine effect size. I still think the 0.5 effect size is good enough, whether you use that GERD study or not. So I think this is a little bit better than a pilot study, Hillary. I wouldn't undersell yourself. I think this is good stuff. And obviously you had more than 30, which Chuck always taught me. 30 is the magic number. But your power now does support this. So I think that your findings from the inferential stats are probably pretty accurate. So good job.
Thanks. And I kind of want to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier. There's a reason there's not very many of these type intervention studies in the literature. Like, these are very
Yes.
for the clinicians out there, like these are really hard studies to execute.
They are.
Like I said, we went in saying like, oh, we want to do at least 3 days a week, and then, oh wait, NCAA rules, got in the way. And, it started out being like, oh, well, maybe we're just going to figure out which player has a deficit in strength, and then they're going to do these certain exercises, and who has a deficit in range of motion, and they'll do these. And then the coaches are like, no, like we had a lot of injuries last year. We want everybody doing everything. So we're like, okay, we're changing the study up. So it's like, we need more of these studies out there, but they're really difficult to execute.
But
Yeah,
I think it
difficult.
calls out, Hillary, that the fact of doing something in the real world, and as and I'm heavily biased that way because I grew up in a biomechanics lab just like you did, just maybe a long time before you did. And I think, I always joke is I'm a recovering biomechanist because you can't control everything. And as you know, in your world today, like there's more that I can't control than what I can. And so I think actually what's interesting to me is the idea that actually I think we think about exercises in a clinical setting that I'm trying to fix something, but like all these guys were relatively healthy and playing baseball and playing at not the highest level, but a pretty high level. Like Southern Cal's baseball program is not a, garbage program. These are really good athletes playing at a high level. So I think it actually captures a really interesting thing. They're throwing a baseball, they're training all the time, and they still got weaker. I think that's the underlying, like, wait a minute, like actually you could make the case, right? In a perfect world, you'd have been able to track the ones that didn't do anything. Like how weak did they get? My assumption would be that you actually mitigated some strength loss with that. So I don't know if did you look at the relationship between the horizontal abduction deficits or losses and the range of motion and the strength changes? Like, was there any relationship between the two?
Yeah, that wasn't something we looked into. And going on your point, like we couldn't control what they were doing for their arm care. That was something we're like, don't do anything like crazy outside of what you would normally do. So they were probably still doing band work and other things before they were throwing. That was just something that there was no way to control. So that could have also, had some effect as well.
And I think I think Phil's point about, around confidence intervals and what you can take away from it, we typically always look at the means. I thought really actually a creative way that you guys presented the responders and non-responders gives a really important clinical view. It's a little bit of, hey, I've got this much time, and in this case, in maybe an athletic training, strength and performance setting, to augment or add something to a program. Should I do that? And I think it's a little bit of prelude to how we approached the other study. Is it's actually through that lens of, hey, I've only got so much time in my clinical life. Can I spend time to do this? And I think to me, it suggests that actually there's a meaningful intervention here for sure for cross-body abduction. Like, right. And it's not a lot. Like, it's not like you did this 3-hour stretching program and all this other manual stuff. It's pretty simple, straightforward intervention had an effect. And then I think the open end, right, is on the strength. What was the effect in the context of the larger piece?
Great points, guys. Hey, Chuck, I wanted to ask, Hillary mentioned the talking about dosing of either stretching or she was talking about stretching, but I was thinking dosing in regard to strengthening too for this study. Do we know yet what optimal dosing is for a baseball player? I mean, do we know what to strengthen the cuff and scapular muscles and to stretch to have adequate flexibility? Do we have any idea? Or are we still just like, shooting in the dark?
It's more than 3 sets of 10. I do know that. I don't know what it is. I think actually it's one of the things buried in the methods that maybe a lot of us just breeze through, but I did notice they actually did a really nice job of establishing a 1 rep max and having a nice dose. And then as I understood, and Hillary, you can correct me or add to it, there was actually a progression that they added and changed over the course. So it wasn't like they used the same 3 sets of 15 in the load at the beginning over the course. They actually progressed it over the course. So even, it's interesting. They changed the load over the course. Now, whether it was enough or not, I think we don't know, but it followed really good strength and conditioning guidelines around here's a 1 rep max. We're going to put you at 70, 80%. And then after every few weeks, we're going to bump you up 10, 20%. So I think it's really well done there. I think the key take home for me from a dosing perspective is that they got an anchor, right? Whether you use a 1 rep max, or you use, a number of reps to fatigue or reps to failure, something in that range to give the anchor for where you start. Cause I think, one of the biggest mistakes we made, we just kind of, here's TheraBand or a 2-pound weight or whatever, and we just give it, and we have no idea in the context of that athlete if it's enough. So I thought it was actually one of the really strengths of that, but no, I have no good recommendations because we don't know how much is enough. I think we have to lean on our strength and conditioning principles and progression, and then put it in the context of our athletes and what they're doing. But Hillary, did I represent that fairly of how you approached it, or anything
Yeah,
you would add on your
absolutely.
dosing?
No, that was perfect.
Hillary, we have a question from someone in the audience. Andre, do you feel the rate of motion increase is a factor? He said, we have seen that if we increase range of motion over a short period of time, we see an overall decrease in strength as the new outer ranges. Was there a pace for increasing the range of motion, or did you just gain it as it came?
Oh, you just gained it as it came. But
Okay,
yeah,
so
that's an interesting point. For sure. And really, yeah, we saw the external rotation surplus did increase, but then we also did see that decrease in ER strength. So yeah, that's definitely a great point and something we should look into further.
Yeah, Phil, do you mind talking about that study I mentioned where they as a study? I haven't seen the whole study, but they had an increase in strength. You said the guy that did an increase in shoulder strength without training shoulder range of motion, but they saw a significant increase in shoulder range of motion.
I apologize for my internet here. It's a little in and out, but that may be a good thing. What I don't, the stuff that I thought you were talking about was actually more than just shoulder. There was a meta-analysis that was published in Sports Medicine in January. A friend of mine, Dave Boehm, up in Newfoundland, he had a meta-analysis that looked at improvements in range of motion just with resistance training studies. He had 55 that fit the criteria for inclusion in this meta-analysis, and found significant improvements in range of motion without stretching, just with full range of motion resistance training. And the cool thing, or the interesting thing, was they didn't find an increase in motion with weight resistance. It was with extra resistance added. So it then, supports this concept of dynamic stretching is really the thing that we see the best in terms of improving ranges of motion. And that is actually stretching, physically elongating the muscle. Is that actually stretching or increasing the length, or is it the actual movement of the muscle and warming it up and exercise? Is that the mechanism? So there's got so many more questions that are out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept for sure.
Yeah.
Because you don't think of that typically, or at least I don't think of doing strengthening to gain range of motion. But
but it's I think about it, it's like none of us are brave enough to only do strengthening and see if range of motion will stay, right? Like
true,
it just,
yeah.
But I mean, if you think back to just our, and I know Phil gets all excited, I start referencing Dr. Yanda, but like, if you look at the neuromuscular principles of why tightness exists, it actually is on a regular basis, right? I think it's a little bit what Andre's getting at. It's actually a presentation of, it's representing the body's trying to get to a total resistance to resist whatever force we're putting on it. So is actually the tightness just a representation of weakness? It's not always. There's eccentric overload and some of the stuff Dr. Kibler and Aaron Shasha and Stephen Thomas have shown of there's actual damage or muscle eccentric things happening, but there's probably neuromuscular effects that are happening. And I think that's what's interesting to me when we think about these targeted interventions, especially, not for sure not telling Hillary how to do her job, but like in Hillary's setting, getting a pitcher to sign up for an overload on their posterior shoulder, you can probably get away with it for about another month, but after February 1st, don't be bringing it. And so I think it's actually interesting what we're actually trying to achieve with our interventions. Am I actually trying to increase muscle force production by hypertrophying, or actually am I trying to kind of reset the neuromuscular system to offset whatever happens in throwing, because I think about the work that Amy Seitz has done, looking at the suprascapular nerve and the tension that it undergoes in rotator cuff tears. There has to be a similar effect neuromuscularly that happens in throwers. And if you think about thoracic outlet and some of the other stuff, not necessarily down that, but you got to think about part of what we're doing with our strengthening is actually to neuromuscularly train in a patterns we want. It's not only to hypertrophy and do
And get
those.
strength. Yeah. Just pure strength. Yeah. Yeah. Good point, Chuck. Good point. Hillary, do you mind, you touched base when you talked about the study about the concept of ER surplus. Can you explain that a little bit more for maybe, I mean, we have like tonight, we have 133 people listening, and my guess is probably all of them may not fully understand that concept. Can you explain that a little bit more maybe, and why you think it's important in baseball players?
Yeah, absolutely. So ER surplus is just the difference in external rotation range of motion between the non-throwing and the throwing arm. So it's usually, we call it surplus because most throwers are going to have more ER in their throwing arm compared to their non-throwing arm. So the value is usually always positive. Whereas if you look at something like GERD, but then internal rotation is usually going to be a negative number. So it's basically a way that we can better understand side-to-side differences in motion. Obviously, there can be bony morphology or posterior capsule tightness or things like that that can contribute, but it also helps us understand, like, is a pitcher hypermobile, their degree of bony adaptation, and really, like, what can we reasonably expect to get from a range of motion standpoint on a given player. So some are going to obviously be more hypermobile, some are going to be hypomobile. Like when we're designing or working with our athletes, we need to know, like, you know, where they stand and what's a realistic amount of range of motion that they can gain, or have they already reached their ceiling.
Yeah. And that surplus that you saw the increase, was that just the throwing shoulder, or was that actually both?
It's only a throwing shoulder measure.
In this study, you only saw it in the throwing shoulder. Okay, that's what I thought. The other question I had was, why do you think you saw an increase in horizontal adduction range of motion in the non-throwing arm that I think was significant? What was up there?
You know, that's a good question. I have no idea. I don't know if it had to do with maybe some of, you know, half our sample was position players and maybe something with hitting. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, that was definitely a finding that caught us off guard that we really weren't expecting.
Yeah. Those are tough to explain sometimes. Chuck,
No,
you've never had that happen where you have something that you have to explain that you didn't understand.
Nope, just leave those parts out, Rob. Leave those parts out.
You don't even put it in the study. That's a good way to handle it. Just leave it out. That way no one asks.
I usually walk away with more questions than answers.
I know.
At this point, that's what I've learned. Every study leans like 5 more questions. I've quit looking for answers and just see what are the next questions to answer.
How do you think we keep our jobs in academia, Chuck? It's every research question leads to more. That's how we jobs, Rob. You know, Robin.
We keep our living. Yeah, that's how we keep a living here. Hey, another question, Hillary, that I don't know that you discussed really, but the ER to IR strength ratio. I think the range, or like someone had like a 98% ER to IR strength ratio or something like that. Or your range, one was like, did I read that right? Someone had 98% ER to IR.
Yeah,
who the hell was that, and what are they doing?
I don't think it was one. I don't know if it was one person. I think it was just all together that was the ratio. But I actually looked into that because I knew you were going to ask that question. And there's actually been a number of studies that have found pretty high ER to IR ratios.
That seems high. Chuck, is that high or is that just me?
No, that's high. I think so in some of the other work that Hillary's published, and I forget if you're a first author or not, Hillary, with Lori, they actually, the origin of descent and kind of the difference in our Latino and Caribbean players versus US players, you see that quite a bit. And a little bit, I think, based on what we've seen in torsion, ties back to Andre's question at the beginning of length tension ratios, because what we've seen in our Latino and particular Dominican players have much greater differences in side to side humeral torsion, which, predictably means their length tension ratio at rest is different. And so it makes me, that's what I think of when I see these wide ranges. Like I immediately go to, hey, what is their resting range of motion? My guess is they're catchers and super tight, but
Uh-huh.
I'd be interested to know kind of what their range of motion was, and also their underlying torsion.
The other thing that made me think about was how we measure that. You know how we measure ER and IR strength ratios, measuring concentric for both IR and ER. I think I remember some studies done in the past where they actually looked at IR to ER, ER to IR strength ratio, where they actually looked at it, how you use it functionally more, where you have an eccentric ER to concentric IR, which may be closer to that, 98% or something like that, I believe. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's, and this is where, right, like the good Dr. Davies isn't with us, but I think, right, in a perfect world, we'd all have an isokinetic testing device and can normalize range of motion and see peak torque through the range. And I think that's what you really begin to see, like differences. I do think I'd be remiss without calling out the work that Stephanie Moore-Reed and Tim Ohl have done with a posterior shoulder resistance test. Like I actually, if you said, hey, would you rather have a handheld dynamometer and use whatever method is there? And I think what Hillary and Lori and those guys have used is probably benchmark for how to do it. It's fixed, it's reliable, what the value you're getting is good. But I think clinically, I kind of trend more to the posterior shoulder endurance test because it gives me that functional posterior cuff strength, right? It's basically a very time-based T. And so I think that's the part that, really kind of interests me, of trying to figure out functionally, which I think kind of what you're getting at, because I think it gets at the eccentric and concentric components to strengthening.
And I agree, Chuck. I think posterior, I don't think we look at it because there's a couple tests looking at posterior endurance. I came up with one that I use where we do a time test in sideline, ER, holding a certain percentage of weight that I've used in a couple studies. We haven't got them published yet though. But I think endurance is a big issue that we don't check usually. I mean, we don't do, I would venture to say most people that look at baseball players or shoulder patients in general rarely look at endurance. They just look at strength, a one-time manual muscle test or, 3 reps of a handheld dynamometer, but don't look at actual endurance. And I think endurance is a much bigger issue. I think the reason we don't see that it's a big issue is because none of us look at it, to be honest with you. I think if we start looking at it, we'll see it's much bigger.
If we don't measure it, it's not a problem.
Exactly. That's it. But Rob, I think it's a huge problem.
Oh, Rob, we talked to Ann Cools out in Ghent, that's what she thinks the biggest culprit is, not range of motion at all. Like if you look at some of that's because of the sports they look at from overhead athletes, but she thinks the biggest one is actually strength, posterior cuff and parascapular strength endurance. Is the one that actually, she's saying that because of the eccentric overload that you happen within multiple throws, and that's actually one of the biggest causal drivers of what we're seeing from the decreased internal rotation, and also from the decreased strength is actually that is what she thinks is the main driver.
Yeah, I think it's a big culprit that I think it's a hidden culprit that we're not looking at. We're just kind of ignoring and not paying attention to. But I think it's going to come to light sometime soon.
She has something to say, but I'm going to jump where she does.
What? Are you talking to me? You're cutting out. Well, George, the one and only George Davies has raised his hand in the audience, so I was going to let him talk.
Say George is here.
Yeah, so I'm gonna press the allow to talk button so that George.
Oh, look! I told you, I knew. I was. Hey, Chuck, I was going to tell you. You don't think that George isn't here? He's in with 134.
Wait, I want to. Before George jumps on, I want to say back in 1990 that my thesis was about isokinetic, eccentric, PNF, diagonal strength. So just the manual isometric strength they're doing mostly now is part of the reason that isometics aren't around as much as we used to be. And that's where George has always been our isokinetic guy, but we've lost, I think, that ability or that capability of testing isokinetically. And I think that's to bring that. That's why I'm glad George is here to weigh in on that, because I really think that's a huge way that we should be testing these athletes.
All right, the general is here. What do you got, General?
I just wanted to I just wanted to let Chuck know that I am here and I am listening and paying attention and learning tonight.
That's it.
Yeah,
You don't have any more wisdom than that? Come on. The general's always got some wisdom. You got to have more than that.
Well, that's enough. I'm here to learn. Although at the asset meeting, we did actually publish a study looking at the concept of the fatigue or endurance concept of the shoulder. And as was already mentioned, I think that's one of the keys. And I don't think it's just the scapula, but I think it's also the entire shoulder complex, scapulothoracic and glenohumeral. And I agree that we need to look at that not only from a strength, power, rate of force development, but also the endurance factors in both, perhaps not only with handheld dynamometry or isokinetics, but perhaps where we really need to look at that is in functional testing positions. Just some ideas.
Thanks, George. All right, guys, let's we've been almost 40 minutes now on our, well, really probably after the 10-minute of introduction, we've probably been about 30 minutes. So let's jump over to our second talk. And our second author that's with us tonight. Thanks for joining us, Garrett. Garrett Bullock. His article is Development of an Injury Burden Prediction Model in Professional Baseball Pitchers. And Garrett, can you tell us just quickly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then just give us a quick rundown of your study. And then we have some questions.
Yep. So I'm Garrett Bullock, assistant professor in school medicine and Department of Orthopedics at Wake Forest, part of the Wake Forest pitching lab. As Chuck said, I was a former hurt all the time professional pitcher when I was with the Astros. I also hold an appointment with the UK Sports Center, which is Consortium of United Kingdom for sport research. Yeah, so this study is from Chuck and Ellen's work from their data over 10 years within a professional Major League Baseball organization, specifically looking at minor league baseball players. Prospectively looked at preseason spring training every year, measure, and then injury surveillance throughout the year for 10 years. And this specific study comes out of actually stakeholder involvement within the important groups that are within the baseball organization. We originally created a injury prediction risk marker model, which is basically saying you have 5 degrees difference of internal rotation, or you have increased external rotation or decreased strength in your throwing arm, and thus you are at red flag versus yellow flag versus green flag. We then moved to an injury prediction model, which would give them an overall risk score, combining multiple risk factors together, including demographics, which has been published in JSPT. But from that, the stakeholders go, well, you can say someone is going to have a higher risk of injury or less risk of injury within a pitcher, but what about how many days they're going to lose? So if we have 2 people that are, red flag for being at risk of injury, what if, how do we differentiate which one needs to get more face time with the physical therapist or overall interventions and resources? We have one person who says going to injure and they're going to be gone for a week versus another one that's going to have labrum, Tommy John, something like that, and be out for 9 to 18 months. And so that's where this study really comes from. And so when we talk about injury burden is really the number of injuries times the number of days lost. And we cap it at 90 days because of where the data gets, there's less people that have injuries above 90 days, but also from talking to stakeholders, that's about as far as they really need to know from what they said. Once you get into especially for the short season guys, if you're missing 3 months, you're missing basically the whole season.
Yeah.
And so that's why, so they said over 90 days, it doesn't really matter to them because they're basically lost for most of the season, if not all of the season, depending on which level they're at. Within the prediction model itself, we found some interesting stuff that so the couple of things you need to know from a metric standpoint, I'll try to keep it simple. I know Phil probably has some interesting statistical questions that I know from the pre-comments. Is that, so the 3 important performance measures are R squared, root mean square error, which I'll call RMSC, and calibration. R squared, which you've probably seen before in papers in some form, is basically how well does the model fit? How well does the model explain the data? RMSC is really the error. So, Phil talked about confidence intervals. Like this is kind of think about that, or the standard error measure for like the goniometer is 5 degrees. We're trying to see the standard error measure in days for the injuries itself. And then finally, calibration, which is the predicted versus the actual performance of the model for each individual participant that's put into it. So in a 1.00 is a perfect calibration, so a 45-degree slope. Anything above or below, you're veering off. Really, if you're 0.9 to 1.1, you're doing pretty good, is what that is. And what we found is that our prediction performance after what's called internal validation, and then really trying to take the optimism out of the model, so trying to make it more generalizable and trying to take with any model that you develop that there's what's called optimism is whatever you see in the data there is probably too good to be true compared to if you did and tested on another team or another season. And that the prediction was pretty good. We had an error of 11 days, so that's really two injured lists. Really of that 2-week injured list almost. The R squared was 0.8, which is a very good fit. And then our calibration was close to 1. So we thought, I think it's 0.98 off the top of my head. So we're seeing that what our prediction versus actual was pretty close to what we saw. Yep, that's probably a good little summary.
Nice, nice.
Before we get discussion.
Well, so here's my first question to you. You said that this is taken off of work of Chuck and Ellen's, and they're both on the study with you. Everybody knows Ellen is just a sweetheart, so she can't be any problem for you. But my question is, what it's like working with Chuck? Because Chuck, to me, he seems like this guy that he's going to have like a contract that he makes you sign with him. That when you work with him, you go in the office, he can only have yellow M&Ms. Maybe he wants some ambient lighting so he can critically think. I don't know, maybe some piped in Mozart music, to relax and calm him. Did you have a bunch of crap like that, or was Chuck okay to work with?
So first of all, the piped in Mozart would be more me than him.
Okay. That's cool. That's cool though.
I like Chad Cook is my favorite one that describes work with Chuck Thigpen. It's working with a squirrel with a laser pointer. If you get the squirrels all over the place, but if you can get them lasered in, it's gonna be something special.
Yeah.
So
good. That's a good. Yeah. That's good. I like that.
That's from Chad Cook, not from me. So.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. So true. But
friends.
Friends
close.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's green M&Ms, Rob.
Green. I'm sorry. Okay. Yellow, green. I wasn't sure what. Yeah.
I got a stats question. I want to jump in here because I love the stats. This is one of those things I had to kind of look back on and look at what calibration was. That was something I think I don't expect anything less from Chuck. I mean, the way that Chuck's done and with these regression analyses have been just mind-blowing to me. And of course with Ellen pulling all these things together, big fans of y'all's. Well, I really wanted to know, I had never heard of the zero inflated negative binomial regression. So
the Zimber.
I'd love to hear somebody's explanation of that, but I'm going to invite Ellen because she's been quiet this whole time. I'd like to see her face.
I don't know if you'll get her face, but
yeah, that might be a little bit of a problem, Dr. Page.
Why?
Just had a little surgery on that face. I look like I went 9 rounds with Joe Lewis and lost, but I'm sure he would have gotten a bunch too. But
okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to see.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Yep. So the zero inflated negative binomial. So what that means is, so the zero inflated part is really, so there's a lot of people that don't get an injury in this data. So hopefully there's a lot of people that don't get injured, correct? And so what it basically, since we're looking at the overall number, we're trying to predict the number of days that are lost for a pitcher. There's going to be a lot of people that have zero, and we need to account for that. And there's really a threshold to get over within in the math. I'm going to use the European and British term, the math, not the math. The math behind the model that say, once you get to this point, then you can get over that hump to go from 0 to 1. So think about that as almost like a logistic regression or like a chi-square of you're trying to get over that 0 to 1. And then the negative binomial is just talking about trying to account for how these numbers go for so long. Like, it's not like we're talking about Poisson, which is what this comes from, is like it literally means fish in French. So we're not trying to count fishes, up to like 20 or 15. It's that these go all the way to 90. So we have to account for this super long tail that's happening to help weight that correctly. So we don't have an overall biased model and that says that, like if you take a mean and you have this one outlier way over here, is that like your mean's gonna be moved like 7 points when it's really should be much further to the left than it is. So that's all that really is.
Math, Phil.
That's a lot of math.
Math.
I'm not
I
good
say
at
math
math.
now. I've been converted.
I also want to, I'll jump right in here of, I saw that initially you guys used humeral torsion to develop the model, but the final didn't include that. Why was that?
Yeah, so we did what's called a lasso regression and then internal validation. And lasso just means least absolute square. And what that is really a variable selection term. And that it can take a variable all the way down to 0, aka exclude it, or it can shrink the coefficient and make it less weight. And now for the prediction model for if you're injured or not, torsion was the one that drove it the most out of any of the demographics, range of motion, et cetera. But in terms of the number of days lost, so we have to take that into account. Torsion really was not influential in this model in terms of if you lost 7 days or 28 days, and it's much more about range of motion and strength, which was all about Hillary's paper. So.
So is it more of like this multiple thing where you were like pulling variables out that weren't, part of the model, how it was done?
So that would be more like a step regression, which like you have like a base and then you take one out. So lasso takes them all account at the same time. So you're looking at the interaction of all of them together. And then it says like, okay, all these together, which ones actually matter? And then you say, well, these two matter and these two don't, or, or these 5 or these 7 or whatever you have. So it's really kind of stepwise takes each one at a time and then moves backwards or forwards depending on which way you go. Lasso and stuff like lasso, elastic net or ridge, you might have heard those terms, all take them all account together and then see which ones if all together mean something or not mean something.
I'm going to relinquish my job to Garrett. So you're welcome to do all the stats from now on. I have, wow. And wow.
You found your stats man.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good job, Garrett.
So Garrett, can you give me like this was like, I gotta be honest, this one was harder for me to read, I think, just because I don't understand all the stats in it.
Yep.
But can you give me and I guess even the listeners too, can you give us an example of like a case, like just a specific case of how this would how you would use this study?
Yeah, yeah. So really this is this is supposed to augment your clinical examination and decisions and not supersede that. So we don't want to take this model by ourselves and then say for Rob, for example, I know you have lots of experience for many, many years with overhead athletes. And we don't want to just say like, all right, now we're taking this model.
many years.
Easy.
But so we don't want to, this is not to say, okay, now we're going to take this model and you can go home and go teach PT students only. This is supposed to help you within your clinical examination. So like for you, say we're working with Wichita State players who, traditionally been an amazing baseball program. And we look at this and you do your examination and you say, well, these 3 pitchers out of the 15 or 18 staff are the ones that I think are higher risk for injury. And then, you can do that, whatever way. You can use our model from JSPT or you can use that from yourself or, whatever you think is best in that way. Then you would say, okay, now I'm going to plug in range of motion, all these pieces into this model, which can be in an Excel spreadsheet if you want it to be. And then it's going to say, of those 3 pitchers, pitcher A is going to miss predicted 3 days. And you're like, he's going to miss a start, or if he's a reliever, he's going to miss 1 to 2 appearances.
Yeah.
So, we give him a little bit, let him keep going. Pitcher 2, you're going to miss 10, 11 days. Probably still okay. Pitcher 3, we're at 65. This is the guy that we probably need to really focus on. Like these 2 guys, we give them stuff, give them some manual, maybe once or twice a week. This guy, we need to really hone in on him before we allow him to go further.
And so when I fill in those numbers though, am I going to know, am am I going to know what the biggest bang for kind of my buck is that I need to look at, and the things that I need to address because it told me that the risk is that big? Is it something that's going to be clear to me what I need to address more?
So I would recommend, so the models, so like the official answer is no, that it gives you the amount of days lost. I think what I tell people, like as the non-official model piece, is that if you see specific ones within that, say, internal rotation to make it really easy, that are really far off, and you see that a really high prediction from that specific variable, then I would say, yeah, that one. But I think most of that you'll be able to see from your own clinical experience.
Yeah, just from doing your exam, getting the numbers that you get, and based on historically what you've seen.
Yeah. So if someone like you or someone like Hillary or Chuck or Phil, then I would say that it probably won't give you that much information in terms of, oh, I need to work on this, I need to work on HA versus IR. Someone that has a lot less experience in baseball over at athletes, say like they're general outpatient and they have, they see 5 pitchers a year, they probably would actually help them move in the direction where they need to go in terms of their interventions.
Gotcha.
And I think the other extension, so when Elle and I started, one of the things that in all the fancy stats that Garrett has tried to educate me on, and Phil, I'm like you, this is a little more than a ANOVA and a simple regression, but I think, I think back to when we first started collecting data with the Rockies, we would see these outliers, we didn't know what to do with them. And then, as we came along, maybe 5-7 years ago, we published a few papers that said, hey, shoulder and elbow injuries look different. They've got a different humeral torsion profile and a different range of motion profile. And the problem is when you put it in our kind of traditional, you get 0, right? You take +5 and -5, and they're in different directions, and you get 0. So I think the biggest thing that, if I was interested when Hillary told us what she does, her job's not to prevent arm injuries. Her job is to prevent elbow injuries. Why? Because it's like overwhelmingly consumes her day. And so I think it actually, the statistics that Garrett helped kind of apply to this actually begin to elucidate what we saw in the data, but I didn't know how to do math to like account for it, to understand that shoulder and elbows actually are different. And then I think, very practically, in a clinical setting, or if you're in a sports medicine setting, taking care of a team of, I've got 100 athletes. I can't spend all my time with all of them, right? It's why Hillary's study was hard to do. Which of these athletes should I actually spend time on? And I think that's really what, as we've gone through kind of looking at this chunk of data from the Rockies over about 10 years, it's really helped us dial in on which athletes should I be spending time on to get the most bang for the buck, not necessarily a specific exercise, but then to look at which one should I spend time thinking more about and applying my clinical judgment
to. More holistically. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we also realized is there's subgroups among the subgroup of professional athletes as well as youth athletes. And so it really helps you focus there, like what's normal for a left-hander versus a right-handed pitcher, and what's the risk based on what's normal. And one thing we learned through all this is while lefties and righties and Dominicans and people born in the US look different if they're healthy, they all look really similar when they're injured. So I think it helps in terms of, overall looking at specific athletes, but it helps organizations and healthcare providers identify which people within subgroups probably need the most of their time.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. All right, guys, we've got about 5 minutes. Anybody have any closing thoughts? Phil, I'm sorry. Phil, I caught Phil with putting a bunch of food
he's
in his
eating
mouth.
yellow M&Ms. Rob, I think what I would say is just the one thing I thought when you and I were talking about which papers to pick. I thought these actually pair together pretty nicely around, hey, theoretically, like who should I be thinking about? I do clearly bias. It's our paper, but Ellen and I measured every one of those players. I don't think I'll be doing that another 10 years, but maybe, but, so I think it's, it's interesting from that standpoint, like it's a pretty consistent chunk. And then I think Hillary's paper really gives us a super practical way to think about, hey, what's a handful of things I might actually go do with a team. And so I think together it actually provides a little bit of, hey, who are the people I ought to think about spending time on? I can't do the whole team, but I can take these 5 guys or gals because they're at risk. They're, whatever we're looking at. Now I can go do something intentional with them. So I think I kind of think about the whole hour of the discussion and kind of the papers together.
Good wrap up. That's a great wrap up.
Yeah, I think Chuck was a great papers. I do have a few minutes, but Rob, what I wanted to do with Chuck was go back to humeral torsion question with ultrasound. Chuck,
yeah,
and Garrett, like you models. Is it worthwhile even measuring this with ultrasound because we have access to it? Should we be measuring it?
If you're spending your days treating overhead athletes and the range of motion isn't responding and doesn't look like you think it should, you better get torsion.
Good. Great answer.
Hillary, you're doing it all day, every day. Is that a fair? Would you agree? And look, you're doing it for real. I do it in pretend, but I mean, I'd be interested day to day what you think.
Yeah, we haven't really gotten into the ultrasound yet. There's some ultrasound looking at the UCL that we want to get into, but that's definitely something that's on our plate.
You tell Ryan Bitzel to get on board.
I don't know who that is.
Okay.
That's going to be hard. I don't know him.
I think the way that Ellen told me one time is the best way to think about it. Humeral torsion tells you how much of that internal rotation specifically that you can affect in terms of whatever you're doing, stretching, manual therapy. If you have a big difference in torsion and then you got this massive gird difference, there's probably not a lot of that. It's just bony adaptation that you're not gonna be able to affect no matter how much you're cranking on it. If you have a little bit of difference, probably can get a lot more of that gird back. Is what it is. I think that's the easiest, simplest way to think about it as a clinician.
Cool. Well, guys, we got like 2 minutes. Ashley, do you need to do some closing again? Thanks, Hillary, for joining us. We really appreciate you joining. Garrett, thank you so much for joining and submitting your article and getting it published. And of course, Chuck, thank you for being our guest host. Ellen, our kind of secret, silent guest host. And Phil, as always, my man, thanks for joining us.
It was much quieter than on last week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're kidding. No kidding.
Thanks for having us.